This will probably be over my head, but we'll try it anyway. What is the pharmacology of opiates that makes it so difficult to, last week they told us nicotine was the toughest drug to beat. In a previous life, I dealt with heroin addicts. I would list that as the toughest drug to get off of. What is it about the pharmacology that makes it so difficult?
Mr. Chairman, it's the same pharmacology would be for heroin, which is it goes and crosses your blood-brain barrier and attaches to receptors, particular receptors that gives you a pleasure to begin with, and as well as a number of other activities. And that's the reason when people have craving, the need for increasing the dose continues, people go to the cheaper, readily available street alternative. That is the same action receptors that we work with MAT, whether they block them, they're partial agonists to them, or they're pure agonists to act it. But ultimately, the idea here is to work on the same receptors that opioids have sort of stayed on in terms of heroin or prescriptions, and almost cause a person to become addicted to that and have the disease of addiction. Now we prescriptively do that with drugs like buprenorphine and others to block those, or actually partially work with those receptors. So it's the same mechanism. It's just the drugs that we talk about, MAT, are not something that people are going to be able to get high on or overdose from in the doses that they're prescribed, but they can if they also use some of the other drugs along with it, the street drugs.
What are the alternatives to habituating prescriptions? What are your pharmacological alternatives to something that is habituating right now?
First of all, we would want to make sure, do the proper testing to find out if there's a legitimate physical reason for it. But then again, opioids are just one part of, they're not very good pain treatment to begin with. There's other options, including non-pharmaceutical options, as well as pharmaceutical options. So we're talking about back pain, for example, very common. Most of the back pain treats itself in about a couple of weeks. So oftentimes you need supportive treatments, not really opioids. That's something that opiates were traditionally used. Combination of medications like acetaminophen and ibuprofen, that really means Tylenol and Motrin put together, tends to have, in some studies, better outcomes or better impact on pain than does opioids.
Okay, you put your finger on something. I present to one of your physician practices. I tell you I'm in pain. I want something that I consider to be strong. You're recommending something I can get at CVS or Walgreens. So I got a couple options. I can either go see another doctor and hope for a better result. So you've got, in July we were told, and look, I like doctors. I grew up in the house with one. I don't get excited talking about prosecuting physicians, but the reality is there are illicit drugs that are handled in an improper way, and there's money to be made doing that. So is this a misinformation issue? I mean, you just said there are better alternatives to opiates. I assume doctors know that. So if there are better alternatives, is it a lack of information that allows them to prescribe it, or is it the money aspect?
Mr. Chairman, there's a whole host of issues. As I was in my practice since 2000 or so, I've been told by the industry that these are medications that are very highly effective, there's no potential for addiction, and all kinds of things. If short-term doesn't work, we have long-acting medications. They're really sold and marketed as the ultimate solution, and now we know that that's not the case.
All right, but you don't get to be a medical doctor by not being bright. So the fact that some pharmaceutical rep comes in, gives you a calendar and a keychain and says, hey, look, you really need to prescribe this medicine even though I made straight C's in college, take my word for it, is a doctor really going to be persuaded by a pharmaceutical rep?
If you look at direct-to-consumer advertising campaign and the pharmaceutical budgets, companies' budgets that go into this type of work, at least the evidence demonstrates that that strategy has to have some impact on the prescribing habits.